any journalist could have discovered as much from available published sources. Our own Ministry of Economic Warfare knew it. They'd warned Bomber Command a month before the raid in a secret memorandum that this would be the case. It said the destruction of the dams would not necessarily have any large effect on the supply of industrial and household water in the Ruhr area. The raid shattered not just the dams, but also Britain's proudest bomber squadron. But the press never blinked. They didn't, like Dunkirk, simply put the best face on failure. They manufactured a triumph and a myth.
Well, there was certainly no myth about the heroism involved. I think it was probably one of the bravest and most skillful operations ever mounted by Bomber Command. The myth, which indeed was created instantaneously and has been recreated many times by movies and journalism and long articles in the Sunday Express, is that it did immense damage to the German war economy. I think you could argue, on the contrary, it did more damage to Britain than to Germany, because the effective loss of 617 Squadron as a fighting unit, which is certainly the best squadron in Bomber Command at that time, perhaps ever, was immensely more damaging to Britain than the minor inconvenience the Germans suffered from flooding in the parts of the Ruhr and parts of Kassel, and fairly trivial damage to some of their hydroelectric capacity.
The survivors of 617 Squadron were decorated for their undoubted valour. It would have been a brave journalist who reported the true facts of the raid. But in war, are journalists alone not expected to be brave?
Any intelligent journalist at the time could have found out what the real value of the target was to Germany, and indeed, articles were published in the United States which were very well informed on what the dam was, what it did, whether or not it was important, and none of that was secret at all, or could have been kept secret. So that it would have been quite possible for journalists at the time, within a very few days of the announcement of the raid, to have asked the question, well, has this been worthwhile?
Well, you see, I don't think a journalist in any particular position to...
Just to rewind there, that guy who was just speaking was Bruce Page, who was a journalist for the Sunday Times. And again, he's one of your, well-informed old Labour guys. He did a lot of work uncovering the story of Kim Philby, the KGB mole, who became the deputy head of MI6. And
who was responsible for many people being killed.
Yeah. And he also exposed a lot about the thalidomide scandal at the time that happened as well. So, interesting character.
So that it would have been quite possible.
Yeah, you mentioned Niall Ferguson earlier on, Horace. Just on the subject of old Labour and some of the stuff we've been talking about recently. Niall Ferguson came out and compared Trump to Clement Attlee the other day, saying that the US empire, basically Trump is trying to do what Clement Attlee did after the war. Kind of interesting, actually. Yeah.
Quite different characters.
Different characters, but if you actually look at the mechanics of what he's trying to do, cut down on empire spending in exchange for, Gibbs for the American people, basically. Kind of... He does make a point. He does make a point.
Rewiring the administrative state.
For journalists at the time, within a very few days of the announcement of the raid, to have asked the question, well, has this been worthwhile?
Well, you see, I don't think a journalist in any particular position to do anything about bungles in war, except say they're bungles. And it's really very difficult to say what is a bungle, because on these very large-scale operations, you don't succeed by taking a series of brilliantly correct decisions. You succeed through making fewer bungles and making bungles in less decisive areas than your opponents do. But war is a highly inefficient business. It always has been, and I'm quite sure it always will be.
However little effect the raid had on Germany, didn't the episode, as reported, give a tremendous boost to morale at home? And after all, morale is part of the war effort.
None of the planning documents justify the thing in that terms. They don't say that exposing our best single squadron to an annihilating risk would be worth it in terms of publicity for our own side. And if anyone had written it in those terms, he'd have been laughed out of court at once. Bomber Harris would have said, I won't touch it.
I don't think they should have published it, because if they had done, that would have diminished the confidence of the country, which was beginning to shake a bit in 42, 43, in the whole idea of a bomber offensive, and therefore it would presumably have been discontinued. What would we have done with that effort, which we had invested? And if we had discontinued it, we'd have lost the advantages which Bomber Command gave the war effort in the last 18 months of the war, which was certainly decisive.
It may or may not be dangerous to admit that your own side isn't very competent, but there you come down to the difference between totalitarian societies and open societies. The predication of our society is that criticism is necessary in order to clean up our act, to get us acting better. You can't suddenly switch partway through the argument to the arguments that apply to a totalitarian society.
You don't think war changes that?
No.
For the duration?
No, I don't believe it does. And the temptation to believe it does is immensely dangerous. One mustn't, in some senses, go wholly overboard. Throughout the war, our press remained more honest and more independent than the German press or the Soviet press.
Yeah.
Until then, though, until that last point, I was pretty much entirely agreeing with this guy.
He was doing really well, wasn't he?
Yeah, that bit was bent, but yeah, he was right until then. I mean, what he was saying was a principled argument for telling the truth and having an informed public, right? It's good. In my opinion, I mean, it's not very elite, but, you know.
There was criticism. Our difficulty is one of degree, that because of the overmastering desire that everybody had to defeat the Nazis, we slipped too much towards allowing the newspapers to be a sort of propaganda adjunct of the government. It became part of the military, part of the ongoing effort. And you can't do that. Journalists.
Oh, sorry, I thought he'd finished. I do agree with him again at that last point, that the only bit he's got wrong is the idea that, you know, that I mean, what he said about the Western press is true. I mean, there was still a large degree of freedom and a lot of different journalistic outlets. You know, you could choose among them. At least they were all cleaving towards the same centre, you know, and the same sort of obedience to the state. So that's not good. What, of course, he's not mentioning is that the effect of believing that we have a free press while not having one is perhaps worse, right? As in, a lot of people in the Soviet Union and probably in Hitler's Germany would have known we're just being propagandized to. If you want a real perspective on things, you probably just can't get it, or you've got to buy some underground mag or something. There probably wasn't anything. Whereas in Britain, obviously, the same is true now. The same is true across the West. In America and Britain, I think it's worst. But people think because there's a diversity of news outlets and because they generally affect to be disagreeing with each other and diverging from each other, which in fact is on a very narrow range of things, people believe themselves to be free. Like, you know, it's just like a mantra, isn't it? In Britain, we have a free press. In America, we have freedom of speech, right? And people think that because you have that notion, or because you have some, like the Second Amendment or First Amendment or whatever it is, that's good enough. But is my point coming across here? Like, people believe themselves to be free wrongly, generally, in the West.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm skeptical as to the extent to which it's ever truly existed, personally.
In peacetime, there is a lot of freedom. A lot, but not, it's not good enough. But
well, petty freedom, let's say.
Well, like there's still more than you don't just have the, you know, in the Soviet Union, you literally had Pravda and one other thing, and pretty much everything else was illegal, wasn't it? I think so. We are freer in that sense, but certainly in wartime and to some extent in peacetime, it's false because they all actually are on WhatsApp groups together and, you know, coordinating and so on, and coordinating things with the Home Office, with the Foreign Office. So it just appears to be free, which is worse because people believe they're free.
Yeah.
So they're not really skeptical.
I mean, is this the argument about, you know, where Chomsky will come in later, and you know, obviously there's censorship and restriction in this early period of, you know, the art of journalism and propaganda, but then it becomes this process of manufacturing consent later.
that does seem to be the case, doesn't it?
Yeah, an interesting anecdote about this guy, Bruce Page. Again, it could be a myth-making anecdote, but there's a little story from his childhood about, the sort of the seed of a pathological journalist. This anecdote goes, at an early age, he demonstrated his determination to distrust loose claims and to check his facts. One morning, he startled Hilary, his sister, by picking up a worm, rinsing it in tap water and chewing a small part of it. When she asked why he did that, he replied that his friends claimed that food they disliked tasted like worms, and he wanted to see if they were right.
That's very literal.
Well,
Commitment to the truth.
yeah.
I mean, a lot of
So they're-
journalists come across to me as just very dislikable people, but still, like, if they are getting at the truth, then good on them.
Yeah. I mean, certainly nowadays they do. They come across as sort of parsimonious and, psychopathic, whereas some of these guys actually that we've seen, these old guard, seem like they're probably quite, good bon viveurs in their private life. But
I mean, who respects Dan Hodges? But this guy has said something that I respect,
I mean, I'd certainly agree that the character and the principles of these people were probably a notch above our current lot.
Yeah.
But that's in the nature of decline, I would suggest. It's in the nature of general entropy that they,
I mean,
we
I
were
think
talking about
that
Michael Burke last week, weren't we? I mean, Michael Burke, probably a step down from this guy, but is certainly a step up from the current lot. But you could probably draw a straight line, from this guy down to the current. I mean, would anybody take the current journalist over Paxman? No,
well, you see,
right? But
yeah,
Paxman,
yeah.
if you go back and watch him from
Yeah.
our point of view, you can see a lot of dishonesty in Paxman, right?
yeah,
But he's
yeah.
still a notch above our current lot. You
I
see
mean-
what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, when I talked about Robert Fisk earlier on, doing a little bit of reading about him last night, and having a look at this talk he gave, he was interesting because he was one of those people, I guess, of this old guard. And one of the things that was said when he died, the word that was often used was he was controversial. Yeah, which kind of means that he did have, some of these opinions, like we discussed about effectively calling out the boomer truth regime element of reporting. And one thing he said that really struck me was he was talking about, the fact is, given the state of reporting nowadays, he said, I've been in a few wars, but you're getting a more accurate picture of war by watching Saving Private Ryan in terms of the graphic violence and the quality of what it's like being there than you are from reading the news. Because he says the news at that time, he was talking about the Gulf War, the news was just showing a kind of bloodless sandbox, where the really, I mean, the BBC doesn't show that many dead bodies or,
No.
graphic violence or anything like that. And actually, in a sense, the sort of the grimness is more invested in the product of Hollywood than it is in the so-called crusading truth-telling super Soroi news media.
Would that be because did Hollywood become, because it wasn't like that in, say, the 60s, was it? Did Hollywood become like that because people were aware that they were being fed something overly sanitized? And at least in fiction, they could accommodate it.
Possibly so. You see, this doco goes on to talk about the young era, the young generation of journalists who covered Vietnam, where they were, very liberal and kind of uncompromising in the way that they approached it. But in a sense, the kind of, I suppose, Spielbergification of war in film becoming very graphic, very realistic. I mean, we were talking a little earlier about bombing campaigns. I watched bits of that recent series he did, Masters of the Air. And that does seem very realistic. It seems like a horrific job flying in a bomber, being, people being torn apart by flak and, fighters and stuff like that. It doesn't seem like it was an easy job at all. But in a sense, that explicit graphic violence perhaps is a great shield for smuggling your messages in, because you're saying, look how devastatingly honest we're being. Look at this. It's so graphic. It's so real. And therefore, the kind of truth claims that we're smuggling in the dialogue are kind of, well, it's easier to accept them then, isn't it? Because we've established our credentials of ultra realism.
I would say Saving Private Ryan worked exactly like that. I went to see it, didn't know much about war, but I was taken by the vividness of the violence. And I did not think much about anything else. And I rated it a good film because it was convincing about in battle. It was convincing battle scenes. Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
you create.
and us.
You create a moving tableau, and people, they'll compare it to things like illustrations like Goya's Horrors of War, with sort of dismembered bodies hanging from trees and stuff like that, and that will kind of elevate it at that moment, and it can trade on an awful lot of that as a sort of pseudo profundity.
That is very true.